Good afternoon. This is Mark Schaefer with Marlon Ingalls. He's from the State Archaeologist's Office in Iowa City. He's come down to help us do a structural assessment of the Bonnifield cabin here in Waterworks Park. Actually, we're sitting in Old Settlers Park, which is a 10-acre parcel of land directly adjacent to Waterworks Park. The Bonnifield cabin is important because it's one of the oldest log structures in Iowa. It was built in 1838. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. And it's kind of an unusual set of criteria that put it on the National Register. When it was first submitted for nomination, the nomination was denied because it did not sit on its original site near Lockridge. But then we came back, or I didn't do it, but the people that did it came back again and said, well, this is an early example of preservation. The cabin was moved in order to save it. Old Settlers Park had a connection going back to members that settled the county, I think, before 1850, and it was an organization that was active up until the First World War. So with those criteria in mind, it was deemed eligible and was listed. Mr. Ingalls here is with us under the auspices of the Technical Assistance Network. Mm-hmm. Okay, I want to say advisory sometimes. But the TAN group, it's a roster of historians, archaeologists, architectural historians. Architects, but you're not an architect.
No.
Okay.
Architectural historian.
He's an architectural historian. And the only man or woman, either one, on the TAN list that did have the expertise we needed in evaluating a hewn log structure, which the Bonnifield cabin obviously is an example of. Now, technically, it's not a cabin, it's a house. Am I right?
That's right. It's a log house. It differs from cabins. Cabins were usually earlier, rude structures made of round logs and put up pretty fast, where this is a full-blown home for people. It's squared timbers and nicely dovetailed corner notching, and was quite commodious building, I would say, at the time period, late 1830s.
Yeah. The Bonnifields came to Jefferson County in 1837, I believe, or 36. The dates kind of flip-flop around. I have here a photocopy of a 1903 letter that was written by W.B. Bonnifield, and that's a picture that Marlon has in his lap here. This was Rodham Bonnifield's son, who helped build this particular cabin, log house, hewn log structure in 1838. It was preceded by what was probably deemed a cabin,
right?
Round logs that were replaced the next year by this house, and the round log house, I guess, had been moved across the road over there by Lockridge and was used as a stable of some sort. W.B. Bonnifield was president of the Ottumwa Bank, the first national bank in Ottumwa. And like I say, this letter was written in 1903, addressed to Hiram Heaton, who was a prominent member of this community and had an interest in bird watching and history and Indian lore and all that sort of thing. Woodthrush Park in Jefferson County is land that he donated to the county upon his death, I believe. I think we've gotten a shot of Mr. Bonnifield's picture, which we keep inside the cabin, so we'll set that aside. And I guess I don't want that to fall over. There we go. Anyway, I was really excited to run across this letter. It was in the files that Ben Taylor had kept on the Bonnifield log house up until his death. And this really gives a nice sense of how people viewed the wilds of Iowa back in the 1830s. There are references in here that are, very, very biblical in their sense of this being a land literally flowing with milk and honey. There were, bee trees and lots of virgin prairie and woods along the rivers and so forth. And Mr. Bonnifield waxes poetic at some point in the letter. It talks about sicknesses that claimed the lives of his brothers and even his father within a year after the cabin was built. This was moved to the park in 1908, which is also the year that W.B. Bonnifield died. So it's kind of a testimony to him as well as to the family at large. Did I mention about the surveyors?
No.
No, the commissioners in 1839, when they laid out Fairfield, stopped on their way back to Burlington and spent the night in the Bonnifield house. And the story is that Nancy Bonnifield suggested that Fairfield, a play on the Bonnifield surname, would be a nice name to call the new city. So they picked up on that, and supposedly that's how Fairfield got its name. So this house, not only being one of the oldest, if not the oldest, log house in Iowa, we're still trying to pin that down for sure. It's certainly unusual for this community in that not very many towns can say that they literally have the birthplace of their community still in existence. I think that pretty well covers the nuts and bolts of this cabin or this house. It's traditionally been called a cabin, and I can't get over that. Maybe I won't try anymore.
Yeah.
Anyway, tell us about your interests and how you got into the preservation of log structures and some of the background that qualifies you for this job.
Sure. Well, I actually started off in archaeology and then switched into historic archaeology, and then as a product of excavating sites like this in the ground, I became aware of the standing structures element, and was able to really develop an area of expertise in vernacular buildings, of which this is really a great example of one of the early vernacular buildings of Iowa.
Maybe we should define vernacular.
Vernacular is buildings or homes or structures built by the common man. They're not high-style buildings. They're usually for a purpose, and they will show common tool types, common construction methods, and are kind of the base type of building that we'll see around in early settlement communities, and it's just essentially a term for the buildings by the common man. And it seems like as I progressed and digging these types of sites up and looking at the archaeological remains, and then I moved on to looking at the standing structures and became interested in how the remains that I was finding in these archaeological sites related to the actual habitation and the structures of this type. You know, I would go out and find them, identify them, and I would photograph and do plans and drawings of the buildings, and really over a period of about 20 years saw more of these kinds of buildings really than probably anybody that I've encountered in the Midwest. I was able to record, I think, over the years about 20 or 30 buildings of this time period and of this type, and eventually I even became interested in the furnishings, how people actually occupied and utilized not only the building but the environment that the building was on, how they set up their field patterns, and how the roadways and such developed, and the transportation routes after that, how these sites were lived in and developed. They grew into farmsteads. The farmsteads oftentimes grew into hamlets or communities, and like this one, which was the kind of the seedling building for the community here, many of these early buildings of this were like the starter point for early Iowa communities, and oftentimes the points where these buildings were located eventually kind of died away as transportation routes changed, as towns grew up. This cabin, I think, became eventually fairly isolated out in the country. It was out of town. The town grew over here. The transportation and road networks eventually moved into the town, and they become isolated, and eventually they usually become abandoned because of their size, and they're hard to convert to modern living. Most of them end up being used as outbuildings or abandoned as sheds or barns or something, and then allowed to deteriorate. They go downhill. And so there's very few buildings like this that actually survive in Iowa, and of this time period I really can only think of a handful that really date to the late 1830s. They're remarkable artifacts. They're like really a history lesson in themselves in some ways. They tell us so much about the opening of the nation, national trends that were going on, and then how those national trends really affected Iowa. And this particular part of Iowa, of which Fairfield really was one of the early commercial centers and transportation centers for this part of the state.
A big land office business here.
Yeah, there were several land offices in Iowa, and it was from the land offices that both the surveyors for the area would go out and parcel up the land in the township and range system of 36 sections per township, and then people could identify their claim sites within those mapped out areas. And so people would come from all over the area to the land offices, pay your $1.25 an acre generally. That was the going price that when this area opened up. Of course, we should talk that this was opened up after the Black Hawk War as part of the Black Hawk Purchase. The area opened up in 1836. Few people, well, some early folks like the Bonnifields migrated in here very early on in 1835, 1836, 1837, and they really were the true pioneer people of Iowa. There was no settlements here. They often were the furthest west settlement of civilization, right out on the edge of the frontier, living amongst Native American groups, untouched, pretty much virgin landscapes. The original topography and natural setting of this area was a series of wood groves that were interspersed with broad expanses of prairie. And the Easterners coming here were really quite amazed, as you said, about the bounty of the area that they were coming in. This untouched virgin timber, which to them was really just amazing. And oddly enough, they kind of had a tendency to look at the woodlands as the enemy, and they quickly would cut those back and turn it into a civilized area. The process, I think, of how Bonnifield got here is interesting in that it really kind of outlines a lot of the social and political happenings that are going on in the country at the time. At the time of the late 1820s and early 1830s, this area was considered the far west. It was almost in some ways as unknown as Africa or Asia in some ways to the east coast of North America. But the mental idea going on in the country at the time, which is really, as we spoke about before, kind of related to the idea of the Jacksonian democratic ideal, where the individual has worth and the yeoman farmer is the heart and soul and the backbone of the nation. And they looked at this part of Iowa in the west and the Black Hawk Purchase out on the eastern seaboard and in Virginia, where he was coming from, as really being the land of opportunity. These second and third generation settlers to America could come out and find virgin lands at $1.25 an acre, establish their claims. They would use what was on their site of their original purchase, which is usually 40 acres or 80 acres or some division of that, and you could take an axe and a knife, and essentially there's nothing in this cabin that you couldn't be constructed with just an axe. And it's also an example of technology at the time, in that although it looks like a pretty rude building and pretty rugged and rough to live in, at the time this would have been quite an outstandingly large house. And it was a technology that was developed for the frontier environment. There's European forerunners to this kind of wood construction that was brought to North America in colonial times, evolved in the woodlands of North America over time until it became possible for these settlers with skill and a lot of effort to come out with no metal except for the axe, essentially, and construct a pretty nice dwelling. And when you go through the house, you'll notice that there's no nails in the house. There's no hardware that's really associated with it. These things on the frontier were too expensive and too hard to get, and they were too heavy to carry. So most everything here is pretty much a product of the environment. The logs were felled and and cut on site. The chinking was clay and daub collected from right around the house and put in the interstices of the logs to make it weather tight. Usually they would move into the house before it even had any solid chinking or walls or anything into it. It was to be just a very rude shelter with perhaps the roof on it. And then over time they would chink the walls, they would cut out the windows and doors after the cabin was built. Then they would cut those features. And once a house was erected out here on the frontier, travelers from all over that were passing by, and I think there's a reference in there to the traveling itinerant preacher that came.
Church services and
right, and it became a focal point for early political organizations, and it was the place that the gentlemen who became the old settlers, who weren't old settlers at the time they got here, first came and got together, and they would help each other erect their buildings and their barns and cut out their homesteads. And it was a very much a dispersed and communal kind of living environment. Later on, with the post-railroad happenings and transportation changes, this dispersed economy and environment of people eventually became more centralized. The railroads came into the towns. The focus was no longer rural in the sense that most of the people were focused in the towns as political seats and places to do your business. And the old skills of the hand-cut woodworking and the make-do kind of operations that you would get on the frontier changed to more of a market economy, where you'd go into the hardware store and purchase your chairs or your things instead of making them on your own.
Speaking of chairs, these Adirondack rockers that we're sitting on, tie that in this kind of revival of the love of the rustic.
Well, it was.
That ties
these
in.
Adirondack rockers are named for the Adirondack area of upstate New York, and it in the 1860s and 70s, and even earlier, but primarily during that time, became an area of rustic living. It was thought that fresh air and the outdoor life were very vigorous and healthful, and hunting cabins and lodges and such kinds of rustic dwellings, copying these earlier pioneer settlement kind of environments. It was a romantic movement in a sense to get back to the frontier, to get back to the simpler way of living, and they would make replicas almost using old-fashioned construction methods. And you can see the raw lumber and sticks and stuff used in the manufacturing of this kind of chair. And actually they turned these out a little more rustic than the rustic individuals here at the time were actually making their furniture. The people here wanted to make furniture that looked like the best Eastern style, and really weren't able to. But these folks who had the best wanted to get back to that simpler mode of living, and this was a popular style that came out of the New York area but spread really across America, pretty much coast to coast, and lasted really about 20 or 30 years in its heyday, but extended a little bit longer than that. And then these, if I'm correct, were brought in when the reconstruction or relocation of the cabin happened. So they in themselves are now 100 years old. Yeah,
and it's funny to see how this comes around, because in the crate and barrel catalogs and things you see, I mean these Adirondack style pieces are back in again. So
well, they've come around the third time. So you find in styles of buildings and architecture and furniture and painting and art and other things, that these centennials or revival things, after 100 years or 3 or 4 generations go by, people forget what it was like in Grandpa's day, or they have some artifacts from Grandpa's farm or home or something, and they kind of harken back to that simpler time, which at that time they were living, it wasn't simple at all. We look back at it as being a simpler era, but it really wasn't. It was an era of pretty good taste in terms of their furnishings and things. They did the best they could, but one thing I've always remarked upon of the era was the hard work that people did. When you think of the labor involved in hewing a building like this right out of the virgin forest here, and the felling of the giant oak trees, and then cutting those down and hewing up the logs, and the construction, and all handwork and axe work and dawn to dusk, hard labor, and it was a short lifespan
Yeah.
for a lot of those people back then because of the amount of work and industry that they did.
And you had mentioned earlier that a lot of the settlement in early Iowa was the timber prairie margin.
Right. There is a pattern of development that historians have noticed really for the last 100 years, but when the pioneers came across, generally as they did, they stopped in Illinois for a season, came across and scouted an area out to settle. Iowa is...
And that's what Rod and Bonnifield had
Yeah,
done.
right. And eastern Iowa is a part of the eastern woodland forest, and western Iowa is part of the Great Plains. Well, the people from New England or Virginia and those areas felt quite at home here in this timbered environment, but it wasn't all timbered, in that patches or groves of trees, usually some as small as a few hundred yards across to miles and miles across, were attractive settlement sites. And so they would come across the prairies and settle on the edge of the timber. And the reason that they did that simply was they didn't have the technology at the time to plow the prairies. The moldboard plow, which was invented, I believe, by John Deere in 1838, wasn't available here. The single tree plows that they had would not break the prairie sod. And as New Englanders, they didn't think that the prairie soils were any good for growing crops. And so nothing grows there, so obviously the trees grow on these soils, and that must be fertile, which was exactly the opposite. They just really didn't know. So they would put their cabins on the edge of the prairie in the timber, and they would cut their fields out of the forest, use the cut trees to build the cabins and their fencing and their firewood and whatever other construction materials. And then they had the advantage of the two ecosystems to really get their food out of. They could hunt in the prairie and the forest. They could get their wood resources from the forest and the animals and game and such really from the prairie margin, which really had I think a higher rate of occupation by the original indigenous animal species at the time. They liked living along the margins. And at the same time, the trails and the roads, which were really topographically oriented, they weren't like nowadays laid out on a giant grid, that was overlaying, in Iowa, both as political divisions and economic divisions. And they were very much following the natural landforms, the best river crossing, the lowest gradient for the hill. Going around the muddy spots was a big deal back then. Certain areas around here were really notorious for being hard to cross, and certain rivers like the Skunk and parts of the Des Moines were impassable really for big parts of the year. And so it was only at this time of the year really that travel around the state was really easy, you might say, when it was dry like this. So as the roadways extended, from generally buffalo trails to Indian trails, perhaps, to early horse trails or fur traders kinds of trails, those eventually would evolve through the pioneers passing through and making ruts and widening roads and felling trees to the commercial highways, like Highway 34. Is that the one through town? That started out as a Indian trail and evolved through the pioneer stage as a postal mail route, first a horse mail route, and then it also gave access to the Indian agencies on either side in the Indian lands. The jays are acting up. And then became, once it was a post road, those systems evolved into our modern highway systems. And so that you have this transition, but it's all very linear in really how it occurred as step by step. And we look at the highway now, and it's very difficult to imagine that it was at once an Indian trail, but buildings like this really give us the context, I think, and as to what life here was like. And it's very difficult to go in a modern ranch house or a modern building and really be able to visualize the living conditions and the lifestyles and the construction and the furniture and all those things that a pioneer dwelling like that can give us. And it really engenders, I think, in the community its sense of history when you have this continuity. Most towns, and I think Fairfield's really lucky in that they have a continuity of the existence from a wonderful, artifact like this coming all the way up into the present day, where you got that continuum going on, and people can, I think, communities really should identify with what their roots are, and this is really the kernel of the root that really began it all.
Well, and one thing I would like to see is have this open more often, maybe have school children come in and learn how to make soap or use a scrub board or
and,
dip candles and do it on site.
Yeah, and be aware of the labor-intensive activities, how you had to make everything from scratch, that there wasn't any really store-bought goods, and you had to churn your own butter, you had to grow your own poultry and clean those and butcher all your own things and saw all your own wood and fetch all your own water, and I think that the house is a perfect, like a living history museum in a sense for that, and for that reason I think that's the positive side of the preservation aspect I think that we're looking into here.
Well, shall we cut off here and stroll around
let's
the
look
house?
at the building itself, and
you can
talk a little bit about that.
Tell us what the doctor thinks.
Yep. Okay.
Thanks a lot. Well, Marlon Ingalls and I are going to look at the Bonnifield log house now in terms of stylistic elements, in terms of the way it was constructed, and then we'll also talk about some of the preservation needs that it has.
Yeah, good. Well, Mark, I thought we'll start with a little bit of interpretation of the general structure, looking at the way it's put together, and that, reiterating before that this is a log house and not a log cabin, and that at the time that this was constructed, that this was quite a large and really commodious kind of building for the time period. We can see that it's in-gabled, that it's of log construction, that it has a three-ranked window arrangement across the front, and then lower down we can see it's got a door window. The arrangement of the doors and windows is really a pretty normal thing, but the amount of the windows is rather unusual, I think. I think that most of these buildings would have 2 windows and not 3. These are called single pin structures, and that the building block consists of one square. A double pin is a square next to a square. Now you can see on the upper story that the 3 windows are arranged symmetrically, and I think that harkens back to the early architectural period, of the late Federal period, where the symmetry of the facade of the building was really considered to be very important. Underneath that, you can see that the arrangement of the window, door, and window is displaced over to one side of the cabin, and it's almost as if this was viewed as a double pin structure, because there is no windows on that side on the lower floor, but that cross section of logs or whatever to make an interior partition was never done. It doesn't look like that was ever happened. So it looks like, although the top part is almost like an old New England Federal style or Virginia looking house, the bottom part looks like another smaller house with a wing out to the side of it. Now the pitch of the roof and this end-gabled construction is pretty typical. It would have been originally sheathed in hand split shakes or some kind of arrangement like that. Earlier on, I think as I was explaining, they didn't have much in the way of hardware. It would have been difficult for them really to nail that roof on. So a lot of the early buildings really were just pressed down with boards on top of the shingles and rocks on top of those, so they could finally get into town sometime and pick up a bag of nails. Then they would come back and nail the roof down. It has an interesting series of rafter ends, as you can see right underneath the edge of the eave. Those are actually cut out in a pattern shape that is reminiscent of the early 19th century, and that there was no real reason to decorate the ends of the rafters, and that was really pretty much an aesthetic effect that this semi-scroll end appearance of these, which are probably just like pretty rough hewn boards up above, really gives it a decorative effect that is rather high style for the Iowa prairie in the late 1830s.
So you think those rafters are original rather than being...
I really do. I think those lookouts, the dimensions of them and the patina of them and the weathering, I should say, the aging, really looks to be consistent with their being original. And hopefully we'll get up there later on. Maybe I can take a look at them to see if they've been altered or not. But it really doesn't look like they have. And the thing about oftentimes in these log buildings is that the logs only go up to the top story, and then the area of the gable peak over here is infilled. Sometimes it was cladded with siding like these clapboards here. Sometimes it was infilled with wattle and daub or a mixture of clays and things. As we discussed earlier, and they say in the letter that this cabin originally, they were very proud. They built it with the logs exposed. Nobody at that time wanted to leave their logs of their building exposed. Not only did the chinking fall out of it, but it was varmints and woodpeckers and rot would get at it. So as quickly as they could afford it, they would sheathe the outside of it. I think he made reference in the letter that it originally had walnut sheathing, and the sheathing was very important in protecting the interior element of the logs and the chinking. And during the restoration efforts, that again hearkening back to that kind of romantic movement, a house like this with the cladding on it kind of looks like any other little old house. It's only till you pull that off that you see the logs behind it. So they probably, you know, in order to achieve that romantic kind of rustic appearance to the building, they pulled that off, but that really has caused the building to suffer over the years in terms of its preservation. And you know, you have to consider that that's what building is 170 years old, more or less. It's been sitting in this location for 100 years almost, and in the last 100 years it's really had no treatment on the exterior. I mean, it's very difficult to paint these things. It's pretty difficult to patch them. You know, it's really needs some remedial work in here to get this building stabilized. I think we have a nice view over here. We can look at some of the logs and how those were done. We can see on the sides that this is what's called a double corner notch, and this is a building construction style that really is connected with the upland south settlement pattern. A lot of the early settlers to Iowa were from Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee, southern Illinois, semi-mountainous areas, but excellent woodsmen and craftsmen. And they would take a log, or tree, and fell it, and then they would go along with the felling axe, which is the axe that we are familiar with the smaller bit, you know, that was used for chopping wood. They would come along and score the side of it. Now, all these marks are the marks of the felling axe. Then after it had been chopped up and chewed up from the felling axe to a certain depth, an individual would come along with the broad axe, which is kind of an offset axe with a big head, and then would smooth all those wood chips off of there. And so the broad axe really leaves no marks, but it oftentimes leaves these scars of the felling axe. A lot of people confuse these with being broad axe marks, but they're really not. Now, like the technology, actually this is a very interesting bit of technology that was brought out to the prairies. The design of these, as opposed to this like log cabin log houses with, as we said, the saddle notch logs, those buildings didn't last very long. Water would collect in the interseas here and then quickly rot those out. You can see here with this sharply cut area that water would drip down and then be canted off to each side of it, which really saved the ends of these from rotting away nearly so quickly. But it took a high degree of skill on the maker's part to be able to do this successfully. I mean, it was
no two logs match. So
no.
Every corner is a custom.
It's individually done, and to be an axeman at that time was an occupation, and it was a title, and it was an honor when you were building a cabin or building a barn at the time. To be designated to be the corner man was like the highest esteem that an axeman or woodsman could kind of aspire to. He was the master craftsman. He was the one that knew how it all fit together. He knew how to lay it out and set it up and make sure that everything fit together at the end. And you can see in these buildings as you go along sometimes where they would take a log and use it in a different way, or they'd cut it too short, they'd cut it too fat, they'd make a mistake, you know, and then they'd turn it over and use it in another part of the building. As you can see on this one, this has been put on a concrete footing there at the turn of the century. So most of these buildings of this time period, the sill plate, which actually would set right down either on stone pilings or something like that, would quickly become pretty rotten over time. What usually happens with these, rainfall comes down, gets it wet, detritus accumulates in the yard and backs up against the wood. Most of these buildings didn't have basements or full-blown cellars or anything in them. Oftentimes what they would have would be a hatch door inside that you would drop down into a square cutout cave, or root cave as they would call it. And so at the original site where this cabin sat, you could probably be able to detect where the root cellar or root cave was underneath there. Later on, they started to put the root caves or root cellars outside of the house, but in the early system, generally they were inside underneath the floorboards and the hatch door, which you would pick up. Some of them were lined and some were unlined in terms of, you know, having like a stone or a brick foundation. Now we can see during the 1900 era renovation that they've done a remedial kind of a brace effect here in order to shim this side of this up, where they put in this looks like an 8x8 post and then run large rebar bolts all the way through the building in order to stabilize this thing along the front. Not very aesthetically pleasing, you know, and you wonder, and I wonder when I looked at it before, whether structurally, whether it's really doing anything at the bottom or the top. Certainly I wouldn't think that it would be necessary to make any changes right where it's holding it together, but it's pretty unsightly all the way across here. It's not really doing very much for the stability of the building in a lot of ways, and it really detracts from being able to really visualize the front of the house. Now, and you can see various places here where weathering has done a lot of damage, and there's checking and there's woodpecker holes and dry rot and things that have occurred, but that actually, I think that it's a pretty normal amount of deterioration on this, and actually it's in pretty good shape. The virgin timber, as it was cut here, was so old, so close grained, and so hard that it essentially was impervious to rot for long periods of time. It unlike modern timber, which is quickly grown and not very good stuff, that this stuff could even be laying right on the ground or in unprotected environment, would really last much longer than any of the modern day woods. And so although this has been exposed now for 100 years in some ways, and probably was semi-abandoned even before that, before it was moved here with no maintenance at all, a lot of these logs have really maintained their shape and their condition. Oftentimes, and although we haven't tested many of these yet, the exterior wood on it would be a little squishy, but the inside will still be nice and firm. And I've actually seen a couple cabins over the years that burned, and they actually took and cut the charred part off, and the logs were still perfectly fine on the inside of it. So you actually take a burned building and restore it back to what it was. You'd lose a little bit in the inside and the outside, but these old oak timbers are so tough. They can take a lot. Now over here, I think you can see pretty well where we have one of the floor joists that was that projects out through the side of the building. This is the way they supported this, the second floor loft. This building, I believe, didn't have a full-blown second floor. It had a loft area originally that was accessed by a ladder through a hatch door. during the 1900 era reconstruction, the staircase was put in. Some of these buildings had staircases originally, some of them had lofts. It just depended on the size of the family and the period, and most of them were designed to be changed over time. We look at these things kind of as static artifacts or antiques, and they're really not. Like any living environment or any farmhouse or farmstead perhaps, they grow, they change over time. Buildings are used and abandoned, new ones are put up, modifications and wings are done to houses. There's a series of these that run across at this level of the log, and essentially what they're done, this is about a 3x4. It's notched into the log, ran all the way across to the other side. Usually the dimensions of these are pretty consistent. They're 18 by 22 or 22 by 26. They're some even number square. Is a lot easier for the rural craftsman to get out and be able to figure things in whole numbers, and for some reason, at the time period these buildings were going up, they liked rooms that were like 16 feet square, 18 feet, or some division like that as it went along. There's some kind of mental preference for that. I'm not exactly sure why. And here I think we pointed out, you can see one of perhaps of the changes of the mistakes. In between the logs here, in order to keep them vertical, or a series of dowels that hold these together. Well, sometimes they'd miscut one and then they'd have to use the log someplace else. So you'll see remnants of these dowels that are left, that meant that this log was originally intended to go in another place or another area, and they didn't need it, it didn't fit, or something happened, and so you'll see things like that which are adapted at the time that the building was put up. The chinking now is really a kind of a soft concrete. It's not, at least it's not a Portland cement, which would have been probably the worst thing they could have done. The most common types of cement that was popular at the turn of the century was Portland cement. This looks like Portland cement, and the foundation is Portland cement, but at least they used something a little more realistic on this. Originally, these were chinked in between with pieces of rock, pieces of wood lath or chips or whatever they could find to stick in there, and then, or even rags, newspapers, whatever they had. I've even seen them with old shoes that were stuck in there, and whole plates and things. And then they would come along and get a local source of clay, mix that together, usually with straw and horsehair or some kind of binding or tempering element, and then chink that all up in there. Now, it was expected that they'd have to re-chink these every 3 years if it was exposed to the weather. That was so much labor, and that was another reason that they would put the walnut siding on the exterior, is that if you had to re-chink this whole building every 3 years, it was just too much labor. They had better things to do. They had crops to get in and clothes to make and so much more. The porch, I believe, was again another thing done around the turn of the century. And I don't know, Mark, was this based on the original, or was...
It was an original porch, which had by that time had been lost.
So although they don't really know I don't really know how consistent this is with what might have been here originally. Certainly these outside posts are really incongruous with the type of thing here. That it might have had just this shed kind of roofed arrangement would have been a very common thing at the time.
The earliest photographs I've seen did not have a porch.
So, these elements here, the rafters, and although this looks like it was scavenged maybe out of another building or beat up a little bit for the restoration, certainly this is more in style with the turn of the century kind of more just simple shed. Yeah, it's almost got that rustic Adirondack look to it, but some of the elements of it looks like these, you can still see the felling axe marks were probably reused when the porch was redone, and other elements of it really look to be obviously done at the turn of the century.
Point out the different styles in axe marks on the...
Yeah, well, we were when we were discussing this earlier, we were looking at the differences in the way this is done. I guess these two beams really give it a good example of two different hands and two levels of skill being done at the same time in this building. This one you can see a very parallel series of grooves left by the felling axe coming along with the broad axe and shearing that off. And here you can see where there was a chamfer that this originally probably sat up and had a roof rafter that was pegged into it. Well, that one never got used on the roof. Now this one we can see the hand of another person cutting, where you see the felling axe marks almost every 18 inches, but there's none of this cross hatching done. So it's either two individuals working at the same time of different skill levels. This log may have rotted and been replaced or substituted at one time. You can see a various series of planks and boards and things that have been stuck into this, as if maybe this one is a replica. This may not actually date to the period of the original cabin construction. It wouldn't have been unusual at any time for these people to take a log out that was in bad shape and replace it and put it back in. We seem to have, you know, early one here, then these other ones that show different levels of skill. These logs all kind of matched. So I don't really know if it was the hand of a different person or a different craftsman, or that these during the reconstruction were changed about. One way to tell in a way is how many borer holes does it have per square inch. These little guys, these wood borers come out of here, pockmark this at a pretty consistent rate every year. The woodpeckers get in and prize them out of there with their beaks. If the bore holes in this are pretty consistent with the ones in here, these should have twice as many bore holes in them probably as these other ones if these were replacements. It doesn't seem to have that effect. I see quite a lot of them in here, and
well, they seem to have more than what we think of the older ones.
yeah, so I mean that could be a product of the tree that it was cut from is already highly infested with those. It could have been in a condition where they got into there early on. You can see in one like this where the bore holes are more out towards the sapwood than the heartwood on the inside of this one here. You know, even they have different environmental areas within the tree that they're going to be more pronounced in. Another aspect of this cabin, I think, in a bit of the history is, and you'll see in a lot of old buildings around Iowa, is that they're markers for the history of the people who come here. You'll see many of these are carved up with the initials, school kids or children, other individuals coming out and leaving a little bit of their own personal history on the sides of these buildings. It's graffiti in a way, but at the same time it's a personal history, and it doesn't really, in a sense, deface these in the same way that the modern vandalism of buildings really hurts them. This was a kind of a natural process at the time. People would sit out here, they would whittle, they would carve, they would do their chores, and they would sit here and they'd dig at the building and they would carve their initials into it. And you know, that was part of the life ways. As nowadays, carving your initials in something is not a life way. There's no sense of recognition. It's just really pretty much vandalism. So moving along, here's another one of those late poles that were put in. Now we're here at, which direction are we facing now, Mark?
West.
All right, this is the western gable end.
Well, it's east end, we're facing west.
Oh, the east gable end, okay. There's a couple elements here. One is a single window on the lower floor and no window up above. Now usually this is pretty common that you only have the 1/3 or quarter sized windows along the eaves in the front and nothing up here. The floor would run up at a point where there wasn't enough room really to stick a window in, and secondly it kind of would have compromised the structural strength of this end of the building. Exposure to the elements, like here, you can see it really makes a difference on the amount of rot and weathering that goes on. The protected corners and the part under the porch really shows a lot less of this checking and weathering of the ends of these beams. Also, as we talked about earlier, one of the problem considerations right through here is the drainage. The drainage difficulties with the siding. The building has sunk. We're looking here at a level or an area that's called the drip line, and you have two problems going on here that really need to be looked at from the roof. And the main one that really destroys these buildings is what's called splashback. And the splashback is when water comes off the end of the eave, it hits the ground, and it pops up into a mist, and then it splashes back against the building about this high. And you can see from this point on, it's in pretty good shape. From this point on, the splashback has eroded into it. Once the splashback keeps it in a moist environment, wet rot comes into it. Once the wet rot gets to the wood, quickly sets up the environment that the termites come in right after the wet rot. Termites never come into a building generally unless it's been saturated with water over a period of time to set up that fungal growth, loosen up the wood. Then the termites come in. You can see a lot of both termite, wood borer, powder post, beetle infestations going on. I don't really see anything active, but it's pretty difficult to tell. And you can see with the drainage problem that's coming down along here, and it's undermined this area right through here where the logs that were put in here, they actually had some original one here that wasn't big enough. They'd lost most of it anyway, so they spliced in some lumber lengths to really make up the difference in the width of it. And then bouncing, the splashback bouncing off this concrete has caused this concavity here. And then you have the second element here and you can actually feel the breeze coming out of this hole right here, and that it's being undermined by rodents, woodchuck infestations. And I hate to call it an infestation, but on a standing building, it really is. They really can chew up and undermine one of these buildings in pretty short order. We saw the chipmunks out here, and they're less destructive, but they're fairly destructive. And squirrels also are very destructive. And of course, the local mice and voles get in there and they begin chewing things up pretty rapidly too. And I know you presently have bats, you know, and the bats aren't quite as destructive to the building, but the element of their scat is semi-dangerous in the sense that dry bat dung carries histoplasmosis, which dries out in old buildings, and if you walk through that, the dust comes up, you inhale it, then you can get a pretty nasty fungal infection in your lungs. And so bats are relatively easy to get rid of, a lot easier than the mice and other rodents that are coming along through here. But this is currently acting, I guess, as your ventilation system. You can really feel that coming out of there. And to tell you the truth, putting it back together, it may not be a bad idea to put some metal grill vents or something on that order down under the crawl space here to keep that well ventilated and keeps a cross airflow going through there so that you don't have the problem with rising damp. I think as we looked at it a little earlier over here, a lot of the rot and problem with this area here is strictly from the splashback. You can see from here to here, here's your eave line where it's dripping off. Here's your line of splashback. From here to here, you can see from the original ground level to what's been lost here is 2.5 inches or so. From this point, it's splashing up this high. You can see how high it splashed up along the edge of the building. Also, when they sparged or cemented some of this area here, when they encapsulated this, it just allowed moisture to build up behind there. It can't drain out, and it sets it up for beetle infestation and wet rot. And this mortar, although it's not the worst that could be on here, it's not very sympathetic in that it's not allowing the building to breathe. It also doesn't expand or contract with the building as it needs to. So, I mean, and that's why you're getting these lines of crazing and failure here, is because it's expanding and contracting, but the cement can't expand and contract. You need to use a softer, more flexible, natural type of agent.
Sort of wire netting.
Well, that's common enough. This is, you can see that they probably, instead of chinking it all the way from inside out, covered portions of it with wire netting. This is the kind of wall lath netting that was real common around the turn of the century for putting stucco on the exterior buildings, and also for plastering the insides of buildings. They used that to fill in and then just went over the top of it with this stuff. And so you see several areas here. This is a more almost a Portland concrete that is really about the hardest, most destructive kinds of materials that you can get between this jinking. You don't see the amount of decay here simply because it's so far up under the eave overhang that it's not getting the splashback, and it's fairly protected, so you're not getting a lot of rot right through here, but you're lucky in some ways. So I think, you know, a correction of your overall drainage right through this area and will really stop the problem, which I think we looked at over here, of the rising damp. I think in certain areas water drainage is coming down through here. It's percolating down into these under the foundations. It's rising up through evaporation and capillary action on the inside of the building, and that's the section where the floor joists, I believe, over here, the ends of those have rotted out. And I think that's probably and partly due to the problem of rising damp, of trapped moisture being brought down here under the soil surface and then hitting this area, rising up through evaporation, then being soaked into the end of the floor joists, providing a wet environment. And once you get a wet environment, then no matter how good your wood is, it's going to go. I think, didn't you say that there was originally an extension that came out like a kitchen wing?
Yeah, it was a frame extension that put on years after.
Oh, afterwards. So this is original door. I think we talked it over, but we weren't exactly sure. We know the front one was. It was common enough to have doors exactly opposite each other that provide ventilation mostly. Again, on looking at the areas that we can see for the windows, that up above they did, because we're under the eave, they were able to put in one window sash underneath the eave and the loft area, but the rest of the building down towards the other end, you don't see any. So this is a single area of that. Then you have the two windows flanking the central door, and then you have this really interesting element of these support rods that are connected to those large beams. I think that what we pointed out on the other side, there's no tension on these. Did you ever notice that? Well, I mean, they're not holding anything up. So then, you know, what are they doing? Do you need them? That's another aspect I would look into, that they really don't improve the look of the building in many ways. They're a hazard for people to certainly walk around in this area. They're not doing their job in a structural sense, and so I would think about some kind of change for those. I don't think it'd be necessary to even take that end of it out, but I would wonder. I mean, they're not holding the building up. So I mean.
Well, the building maybe is settled as reason those are flat, but
yeah, but at the same time, yeah, you're not going to. There's no reason to jack this thing up and level it all out. So I think it's part of an interesting history of it, and it's kind of an antiquated way of approaching a structural problem that probably should have been dealt with in a different manner at the time. But
So talk about the wire over the windows.
Sure. Well,
It has kind of interesting history.
looking at this is fence wire. Now, the Glidden patent of the early 1870s was really the start of the barbed wire trend, or woven wire, and shortly after barbed wire became common on the market, these woven wire fences became a really hot commodity. As we said, a lot of the lithographs of Iowa farms, a lot of them maybe in the Andreas Atlas of 1874, show the housing area, the yard compound. They had a different idea of what a yard was than we. They had front yards, door yards, side yards, backyards, poultry yards, cattle yards. You know, there's a lot of different yards back then, but this was basically used to enclose an area of the front yard to both keep the hogs out and keep the sheep in. They didn't have lawnmowers, obviously, so they would pasture their sheep around the building, enclosed by this, big enough for small things to pass through, but not so big your sheep is going to get his head stuck in there. And also, woven wire of this type was a fairly common commodity in the hardware stores around here. I think we looked at this, and I thought that this wire probably dated to the mid-1870s. And so, although they produced this kinds of wire in various patterns, well, they still produce it, but of this gauge of wire and type, this lasted up until just past the turn of the century, so that this itself got used on the building. Is interesting that it was an available material, but secondarily that at 100 years on its own attached to the building, it kind of acquires its own significance, both in the interpretation of the building, its original restoration, which it was part of, the security that it was used for.
And does not appear on early
doesn't it?
Here.
And
So
just
it was added maybe in the 20s.
Yeah, and just kind of the homey security method that was applied here, how to deal with potential intruders to a building and keep them out. You know, locks are for honest people anyway, and so are these kinds of things. If anybody really wants to get in here, they will. But the difference is that the other windows have a different kind of screening. This screening is a little bit different. This is two layers of mesh. One's pretty much a poultry fence, and then the one on the inside is a type of poultry screening that was also available around the turn of the century, that you really you see wire this type engaged with the same size squares, but what you really can't see is how these wires are all individually soldered together at all the interstices. A really pretty primitive construction method for the wire and the technology of wire production at the time.
So what is your recommendation for chinking?
Well, the modern method is somewhat similar to what they did here, in that you can buy organic, a stable mesh, a plastic mesh, or a galvanized metal mesh to put inside of there, and then we'll work on reconstructing some old formulas of mixing the right amounts of clay and some dauber and filler like straw, prairie straw, hair and things, and then adding some components, some modern hardeners and things like that, so it'll have reliability and last quite a while. As I said, these buildings were originally not meant to have their chinking exposed. And so, sure, this lasted nigh on 100 years, but at the same time, it's very hard on the building. It doesn't breathe, it doesn't expand or contract. You need a soft or organic or a clay-based type of material that will move along and flex with your building. It will entail a little more maintenance on it, but it won't destroy your building over time.
So what's the life expectancy on this new
Well, it's kind of like painting your house. You know, you can 10 to 20 years depending on how good you're going to do, and that's about really anybody can hope for in a material that's not really going to be detrimental to the building eventually. We can look into some other formulas. There are pre-made, I believe, materials for chinking and stuff. It depends on what level of authenticity you want to go back to. That's always in preservation one of the most significant questions. What level of restoration or stability do you want to get back to? And economics and time and ability and all those factors go in to see what's possible, what's probable, you know. And so that's the kind of decisions that you're going to have to be making in terms of the preservation and hopefully restoration of this over time. This is a huge long-term project, I think. As you know, without an infinite amount of dollars and things to put into this thing right away, we're going to have to set up some kind of an incremental plan. Sure. Things to start with first. Obviously, I think the roofs are #1 considerations, and when the roof grows, the building certainly follows quickly behind. The roof deteriorates, and then you know, all your other troubles go along with it, you know. And I think the problem with the rising damp and splashback and those things aren't necessarily ones that's going to cost you a lot of money. Those can be mediated by simple grading, a little bit of tiling, some splash guards potentially up above, which miss the rainwater instead of letting it fall directly down and bounce back. It breaks it up into small droplets so it falls down and just really soaks in and goes away.
Putting guttering on it.
Yeah, I mean, it never had guttering originally. If you're going to do a sensitive restoration, you don't want to put guttering. The guttering would look so bad on this style and age of building that a good preservationist would really be aghast. It'd be like putting aluminum siding over the top of it almost. It would almost be that heinous. So, you know, it's meant to have these open rake eaves like this with you know, no soffits or no underboards and just the planks of the roofing hanging out over the edge. You know, somebody has gone up there and put a drip edge on there, which probably even originally wasn't there, but that's again the kind of thing that you got to have on a modern building. You may want to replicate the roof, but unless you put a drip edge on it, nowadays we know that your roof really isn't going to last nearly as well without the drip edge on it. The water and the ice damming will bring the water back up under the roof and tear it up.
About a 4-inch cedar strip or something along there.
A fascia board?
Yeah.
I would look and see, I don't see any nail holes into there, and so although up above I see under the drip edge there is what's a small remnant perhaps of a fascia board that's very thin, and so that's part of the dilemma as you get into it and see what was original, what did these things have, you know, and go look at some other examples of what people have done and see how they dealt with that same problem. You know, if you're going to replace it, I believe with the cedar shakes like it was originally had. Usually you can overhang those so far, and if you buy the good ones, you're not going to have quite as much problem with the ice damming or the moisture coming back up underneath the edge of your shingles. If you have a far enough projection, there's a limit to how far you can go with those. You don't want to make the roof look too wide either. There's a lot of the visual aspects to this that are going to be important too. If you hang your edge of your shingles over an extra 3 inches, well, suddenly your profile of your roof and the building is visually changed from a distance, and you know, that's probably if you're getting grant money to especially replicate the roof, then that's going to be one of those design things that they're not going to appreciate, you know, when it comes to the review of the process and stuff.
Okay, we've got a couple more things I want to address before we tie up.
I want to talk on drainage just a minute.
Oh, sure.
With this door here.
Let's get you on the microphone.
And this level
We need to
back,
get you on the microphone here.
I'll move a little closer.
how about drainage here? I thought we could put some soil in all along here except for that door.
No, you don't want to put
You don't
soil
want to
in.
put it in.
You want to take it out. You want to take dirt out and never put anything up against her anymore. That's putting it up there is just going to wick moisture into the building underneath. And
So it has to be quite a bit of dirt moved here, or just make a drainage trough, like in each direction.
actually, what you need to do is to come about this far out, taper this down to here, and then grade that up so your water runs out along here. Now, I would put a drainage tile in the ground out here. If you put a trench for drainage tile here where the drip line is, it's just going to pull things into the building. So you really want to start your grade here. You want to crown it and make sure like that's the high side there. It's going to want to run that way. So have a bit of a dip or a small trench here, taper it up towards the building, and then like a gutter, let it go down and around over there, which you've got settling and things on that gable end that you really, where he's standing there now with the camera, that needs to go down 5 or 6 inches and down and away. And then instead of this stuff, it's coming along the edge of it now and actually turning the corner here and running down into there. It will come down to this natural swale over here, so you want to take it off and over this way, and then cant this one off and over that way. So each one, if you can't interconnect them, you know, to make them run off, then you're going to have to work the other way, because you can see the difference between here and along the building down to that edge. There's a good 8-inch drop, and then in towards the building you can see where the drip edge has caused the loss of 4 inches of soil. So everything that's falling here right now is going right into the building. And this having this concrete or this iron pipe right here is probably just a funnel for it to come right down there and drain right into the bottom, and what gets past that goes into the rodent burrow. And that's another problem with the rodent burrows. They're just like a well, you know, that water's going to flow right down into them. It's going to go down into the holes and the passages, and it's going to stay in there. These hilltops like this, although it has a surface layer of loess and things on top of it, this is part of the glacial southern drift plain of Iowa. It's mostly composed of clay soils down below, very fine particles, and pretty impervious, and so the water is staying on top of the clay layers, probably flowing along just through this kind of humic loess buildup, and then some humic buildup with the clay underneath, not really being able to penetrate down through there. And so, I mean, this water that is traveling along here is right on the surface. You're not getting any percolation down through there. I don't know how far the bedrock is down here. It's probably 30 or 40 or 50 feet on a hill.
Well, north of town, I know it's 144.
144. So, yeah, so that's quite a bit. And then the rest of it's till, clay cap with loess and you know, forest soils. Or this looks like it was always a oak woodland, kind of a tertiary forest environment here. So these forest soils again are not as well drained as one might hope.
Well, let's take a break and go inside and look at the windows.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, when the cabin was moved here in 1908, I guess the fireplace was long gone, and so they just reconstructed this. Your feeling is that it's starting to lean into the wall, or what's the deal here?
Right. Well, you can't see it on the inside, but this stone mass construction here is not at all what a cabin of this period would have had. The original cabins had chimneys made out of log chips and sticks tapered up and then coated with clay, and they're called a catted chimney. Those are replaced relatively early as soon as they could get some stovepipe or something on that order. Limestone chimneys, exterior chimneys around this area, are really an unusual feature. If this originally had an exterior chimney of this type, that's definitely typical of the kind of upland south building tradition. It never would have been this massive. Now, I don't know what kind of footings are under this, but I think we were noticing before that the weight of this chimney is actually pushing against the side of the cabin, and I have a strong feeling that this concavity up here is a product of the chimney mass pressing against the side of the building, relatively unsupported, leaning in and then pushing that whole side. If you look up above the chimney, it's directly across, just as it should be, from the point of the log that's pressing on down. It's pushing in the entire wall, and you know, that's causing both, you know, your drainage problems and difficulties with the stability of the chimney stack here on top of it. And I would, although this is part of the restoration and part of the 1900 restoration and reconstruction, and being as how it's 50 years old, it has acquired its own integrity in a way. I think in general it's so detrimental to the building and so out of style with it that you'd almost be better off whittling it down to some smaller mass, perhaps working it down and seeing what's on the inside, getting a good bit of this weight away from it, and then figuring out, you know, what the problem is with it pushing into the side of the building. Eventually this is really going to cause you, I think, the ground here probably seems to be relatively stable. Otherwise, if this was saturated all the time, this whole mass pushing on the side of this building is really going to put it out of kilter. They got it supported that way. They didn't do anything about the support that way. They put this 5-ton mass here on the end of it with really nothing supporting, and maybe it has a concrete footing underneath it that's keeping it a little more stable. But
Well, if my memory serves, the house did have a fireplace on this end.
okay,
So whether it's the original fireplace or not, there needed to be one here. An early photograph I've seen of this after it was moved had the stone base here, but where it's brick up above was the stick and daub, wattle and daub. What did you call it?
catting.
Catting. Okay. But that was later replaced by these bricks. Now, can you date those bricks by the type of brick that it is?
Yeah, a little bit. They are soft mud brick. They're not soft mud brick of the early period. They're not of the 1840s, probably to the 1860s period. There are some elements you can see on the glazing there that's left on that brick, and some of the patterns on the others that they were probably done in an exterior kiln, but in a local brick yard. And I would suspect that these bricks were probably made between the mid 1870s and the early 1890s.
Okay.
And although they are soft mud brick, they're spalling terribly. What the problem that they made with these, there's a difference in soft mud bricks. One being that the ones fired on the exterior of the kilns are harder, and those were used on the exteriors of buildings. The bricks in the same firing on the interior are soft and crumbly, and they were used on the insides of houses or areas where weathering wasn't a problem. Well, they took bricks, not knowing the difference, and mixed in exterior bricks with interior bricks. And the interior bricks are too soft both to hold the weight and survive the elements. They're very porous, and they'll wick water right into them. The freeze and thaw cycle in Iowa is so extensive that you can see this really excessive spalling. But that spalling on that lowest course is another product of backsplash. Because that's not draining properly, it's hitting and going back in there, therefore it's wicking back up into the brick because it's capillary action.
Flashing on there would be good.
And yeah, it's freezing that every year, and then it's starting to spall it off. Next to that, in the corner, they have an exterior brick. You can see two of them there that are the right kinds of bricks. Above that, they've used the wrong kinds of bricks. And so you can almost see which ones are interior bricks, I mean, because they're all spalled out and rotten, and the ones that were exterior bricks because they're really in good shape and keeping their relatively solid and straight edges to
Now, is the
them.
mortar too hard of a mortar for that brick as well?
Conceivably, yes. If you see that brick right there in the corners, on the corners, when you see wedge-shaped spalls taken out of the corners of the bricks, that means that your mortar is too hard, that it's expanding and contracting at a rate inconsistent with that of the brick itself, and because it's too hard, it spalls off the corners of the bricks. So you can see a little areas of it that are beveled in some of these bricks, and that's an indicator. So I guess we can go back inside and let's talk about some of the interior elements.
Well, what type of structure should be out here?
Well, I think we'll just have to consult some reference materials, really. This is cabins of this era. You don't want to put a catted chimney necessarily back if you want it functional. It just won't last. If you want to put a limestone chimney or a brick chimney, generally they were slender, and they were had a shoulder area to the stack, which there's plenty of photographic and historic examples, I think, that we can consult to see what would be a good way to replicate this or do something to ameliorate the difficulty that this huge mass of concrete and stone is pushing in the side of your cabin.
You can see where the squirrels are peeling over
Right.
the side.
Yeah, they're burrowing right into there. But with the removal of this whole mass, I think the whole structure will kind of give a sigh of relief, as if somebody took a 100-pound pack off your back. And
Although that chimney, it doesn't show that stress at the base. Looks like it would show by now.
well, it's really hard to say what the chimney is doing inside of there, although you don't see the same amount of pressure. It's excuse me, it doesn't have nearly the same mass as this
No, but I mean,
bottom.
it looks like with that tipping in, it would show cracks at the base of that chimney.
Well, I don't know, it's got so much concrete up there, maybe it's cracked and we just don't even see it. That's possible too. I mean, I don't see any really obvious or visible cracks.
Tim, the brick
but-
tips in a little bit. It goes in slightly.
It does go in just a little.
So, you know, maybe they at least did a mortar soft enough that it is allowing it to flex and bow a little bit without just cracking. If it was hard mud brick or some other thing, it would have probably just fractured.
Well, Marlon, you have some literature here on preservatives and
Yeah,
that good sort of stuff.
we discussed and went around the building talking about the original sections and the modifications and problems that were done, or inherent problems with the buildings when it was rebuilt on this site at the turn of the century. We've looked at the drainage problems and backsplash and insect infestations and animal infestations. And now I think just quickly I would talk a little bit about modern efforts and materials to remediate that problem. We really need to stop the ongoing deterioration of the wood, the historic fabric of this building. Each board and element of its original construction is part of its historic fabric. The more of that you take away of the original materials, the more the building suffers in its originality. I brought some materials discussing primarily chemicals with a very low toxicity that are used to stop fungal infestations and insect infestations. They're based on borate materials. The procedure is to take these and spray slightly on the exterior of the building to stop the surface growth, but then in places that are not visible, drill small plugs out. These elements, these chemical elements, are injected into the wood under low pressure or just inserted into the wood in the form of a plug, and then they diffuse through the wood in very minute amounts and stop all the fungi and bacterial and insect problems with your woods.
So often you replace the plugs.
You can. They have a life expectancy of decades, essentially.
Really?
So they take very little. They take no maintenance once they're put in. Their properties are that they have practically no toxicity to animals or humans, that they're extremely stable, that they're relatively inexpensive, that they can be done by local preservationists or people without a lot of technical skill. The other side of it is to take these already damaged materials, the woods and elements that have already suffered from rot and infestation, and bring those back a little bit, stabilize those. There's essentially two methods to do that, of which the most important really is material that it's epoxy type material, I'd have to say, although it's not exactly an epoxy, that is a penetrating material that goes right through the wood and stiffens it up almost to the point that it looks like it's brand new or as good as new. On the cellular level, you can see the difference in how it's like actually holding the structure of the plant fibers and stuff together. From the surface, you really can't tell that anything's been done to it at all. That really you can take and apply or paint over pretty rotted materials, and boom, they're almost as solid or as good as they were.
And how deeply does it penetrate?
It penetrates all the way through.
Oh,
essentially, the capillary action of the wood just sucks the material right into the center of it. Although, you know, on really thick pieces, obviously, that's where you use the borates and other materials and injection process under pressure to diffuse it. But on small areas or on the ends of logs, especially on the deteriorating ends of the building as it is here, it really just wicks it right up into it by capillary action. The second element is actually a restoration of the elements that are gone when you have large areas of checking or rot at the ends. You really, in some measure need to deal with fixing those because they'll continue to wick moisture and attract insects and things into the building. You can essentially take some modern epoxy compounds with a kind of a wood fiber base, put those in there, let them dry, sand them off. They're extremely stable, they're non-toxic, and you can actually grain them or sand them and make them fit into the match is almost invisible to the eye.
Now, how about entrapping moisture?
Well,
I know I've read about stone buildings that they seal to protect.
Right.
It trap moisture, and then the stones fall worse than if they hadn't done anything.
By the end of the process, when you're really through it, you've used these products perhaps, a wood building like this is going to wick moisture. It needs to breathe. You need ventilation both in the interior of the building to let it breathe, and you also need to let the interior of the wood breathe. If the interior of the building is closed up, or you have a ventilation here that's not outside, it'll actually pull moisture through the logs into the building, make it clammier and wetter in here than outside. Moisture can wick the other way depending on the ventilation, so we need a good ventilation system in here. To do that, we need to also think about treating the exterior of the building with a simple linseed oil or lemon oil or something like that, like you would a piece of furniture essentially. If you coat the exterior of the wood with this oil, it'll become water repellent, and it'll also, as a petroleum product, it will wick itself into the surface of the wood and become water repellent. And so with a relatively cheap application of 5 or 10 or 15 gallons of good quality linseed oil or something like that, you can really stop that moisture or penetration. Like anything else, any home, it needs maintenance. Every 10, 15 years you need a maintenance schedule to keep it up. Once you get started, once you get the building stabilized, you'll eventually set up a maintenance schedule, and you'll know that in 5 years we need to check for termites. In 10 years we need to see if we got any fungal problems. In 15 years, we're going to need to see how other elements are holding up and keep those up to date and in good care. So.
Sounds daunting.
It is. It's a long-term project. I mean, you start a little bit. Start with the roof. When the roof goes, the whole thing quickly follows afterwards. So, in the brick and mortar project, the roof is the first thing. Start with that. The rest, we'll build up a plan over the next year or so to stabilize that and set up a direction and some various steps and ways to go with it.
We talked about doing some grading outside, some tiling around the base.
And tree trimming.
Yeah, I didn't know if you got on camera about that.
Yeah.
Anybody that comes out here and looks, you can see that the front edge of the porch roof is deteriorated a lot more than the part of the porch roof next to the house, and that's because there's some overhang from the foliage nearby. So if we cut back that a few feet,
you gotta let the building dry out. When you have too much foliage around it, just like your own home and guttering, that if it's not getting good ventilation on the exterior, it's not able to dry out, then that's the perfect environment for wet and dry rot to invade your building. And once those things come in, the insects are quick to follow. So we'll trim the trees back, open up the spacing a little bit, a little more of a lawn and an entrance, get a little more sunlight on the building, and get some good quality shingles that are rot resistant, perhaps already safely treated in a non-toxic subject, so that they'll last a good long time for you. And that's the best place to start, and from the roof, and then work our way up and stop the drainage problems and stop access for varmints and other things getting in here, and get the building stabilized. And once it's stabilized, at least it's not deteriorating any further, and from that point on, then we can bring it back to its original fit and finish and really make it a showplace for the community and an educational living history museum farm environment like really no others that are around the area. So
yeah, I think we have a good resource here. We just have to save, maintain, and develop it. I really appreciate you coming down and
my
giving
pleasure.
us this advice.
So
this has been quite educational. I mean, this didn't get on camera, guys, but this man was looking at screws in the building, and he goes, "Oh yeah, this screw dates back to because, oh my gosh, it just goes on and on." I mean, this man can date the nails. So it's too dark in here to really show the doors, but we kind of figured that maybe some of the original pieces of the Bonnifield doors were used in refurbishing, and they probably were.
I think they did as good as they could at the time with their abilities and resources to maintain the historic fabric of the building.
And then you had this charming arts and crafts fireplace with, like a 1908 rustic rendition of what they imagined it would look like.
They thought it was very romantic. It's not what we would now call a very sensitive addition, but those are the kinds of things that we can work with.
And it's part of the history now.
It's part of the history now. It has its own integrity. The difficulty with the fireplace is that it's pressing against the side of the building, and that's one of those features, along with a little bit of the problem with the floor joists and things like that. We'll just need to get under there one of these days. We'll get the floorboards up in places, and we'll actually see what's down there, and then we'll see where to go.
Yeah, we're going to start adopt a groundhog program. Get that critter out.
Relocate.
Yes. Anybody needs a groundhog, we got one. Seriously though, I do appreciate this. Obviously, this is going to take some money. If anybody has a vital interest in the history of Jefferson County, or if, like myself, my great-great-grandparents spent a couple of nights in this house when they first came to the county in the 1850s to homestead. I mean, there are a lot of people that have very personal ties, whether it's Nan Cameron bringing her kids to picnic on the front porch when they were little to give them a sense of the history of our country. People that carve their names, WL plus who knows who on the door. I mean, this is really a part of the fabric of the community.
Money is great, but experience and labor and effort, a lot can be done by a group of scouts or a group, community group coming in for a day, and a little painting or sanding or lifting or raking, and really adds up.
Stonemasons, bricklayers, roofers, you name it.
Skills.
Yeah.
And advice. Sometimes things that we can, a preservationist or a restoration person can do on their own if they know how, and just the advice of, having someone come in and outline what needs to be done, and then we can do it.
We will be applying for some grant money. The Jefferson County Historical Society, the Jefferson County Historic Preservation Commission will be involved. The Questers groups, the two chapters of Questers in this town have expressed an interest. And lots of individuals. We're starting to get a few small donations. Donations can be written, checks can be written to the Bonnifield Cabin Fund, and the auditor's office at the courthouse will take care of that account for us. So you can mail or drop those by the auditor's office. And like I say, we will be applying for some grants. Most grants ask for either matching funds or in-kind donations, whether it's labor or materials or whatever.
Right.
So
labor is as good as money.
Yep. Keep that in mind with us, and give me a call. My name's Mark Schaefer at 472-5418. Marlon Ingalls, it's been a pleasure to meet you, and hope to have some more contact with you.
And anybody else that has old buildings or barns and such furniture and things can contact me at the Office of the State Archaeologist in Iowa City, and we'll be glad to answer anybody's questions that come up along there. So thanks a bunch. Thanks for showing me this resource.
Yes.
What a great building, and what a great piece of Iowa history it is.
And thank you for watching FPAC.